Thank you.
The question is as follows.
Mr. Poilievre, seconded by Mr. Viss, moved that given that since the NDP Liberal Prime Minister took office, opioid overdose deaths across Canada have increased by 166%, according to the most recent data available, the House call on the Prime Minister to
Proactively reject the City of Toronto's request to the federal government to make deadly hard drugs like crack, cocaine, heroin and meth legal. B. Reject the City of Montreal's vote calling on the federal government to make deadly hard drugs legal.
C. Deny any active or future requests from provinces, territories and municipalities seeking federal approval to make deadly hard drugs legal in their jurisdiction. And D. End taxpayer-funded narcotics and redirect this money to treatment and recovery programs for drug addicts. La période de 10 minutes pour
The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person.
All those in favour of the motion will please rise.
Mr. Scheer.
Mr. Scheer.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mr. Barrett.
Mr. Barrett.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Richards.
Mr. Richards.
Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Aboutayev.
Mr. Aboutayev.
Mrs. Block.
Mrs. Block.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Brassard.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Ms. Gladue.
Ms. Gladue.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Retour à Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford, Lloydminster.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford, Lloydminster.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Giovanni.
Mr. Giovanni.
Que tous ceux qui s'opposent à la motion.
All of those opposed to the motion will please rise.
Mr. McKinnon-Gatineau.
Mr. McKinnon-Gatineau.
Mr. Fraser.
Mr. Fraser.
Miss Hutchings.
Miss Hutchings.
Miss Sachs.
Miss Sachs.
Miss Chager.
Miss Chager.
Mr. Vandal.
Monsieur Vandal.
Miss Sahota.
Miss Sahota.
Madame Pittspat-Taylor.
Madame Pittspat-Taylor.
Mr. Ananda-Sangari.
Mr. Ananda-Sangari.
Ms. Jasic.
Miss Jazik.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Ms. Debruson.
Mr. Bruson.
Mr. Baptiste.
Mr. Baptiste.
Mr. Kuzmarchak.
Mr. Kuzmarchuk.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Brière.
Madame Brière.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Long.
Monsieur Robillard.
Monsieur Robillard.
Monsieur Zuberi.
Monsieur Zuberi.
Mrs. Aid.
Mrs. Aid.
Mr. Aldag.
Mr. Aldag.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Madame Diab.
Madame Diab.
Ms. Kayabaga.
Miss Kayabaga.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. McDonald-Malpec.
Mr. McDonald-Malpec.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Simard.
Monsieur Simard.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame Vignola.
Madame Vignola.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Monsieur Lemire.
Monsieur Lemire.
Madame Saint-Clair-Desgagnés.
Madame Saint-Clair-Desgagnés.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Miss McPherson.
Miss McPherson.
Mr. Green.
Mr. Green.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. Backrack.
Mr. Backrack.
Madame Hughes.
Madame Hughes.
Monsieur Bouleris.
Monsieur Bouleris.
Mr. Desjardins.
Mr. Desjardins.
Ms. Zarillo.
Ms. Zarillo.
The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings. Je désire informer la Chambre que la...
I wish to inform the House that the electronic voting period has ended.
Oh, come on. If members were not able to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function and the chair will recognize them. The Honourable Member for New Brunswick Southwest.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, I was not able to log on. The camera would not recognize me. I'd like to cast my vote yay, please.
Mr. Iacono.
Présidente, je vote contre.
Monsieur Iacono, nay contre.
No one else? Le Bureau va maintenant compiler les résultats.
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 117, 117. Nays contre 204, 204.
Je déclare
I declare the motion defeated.